So, what I want to talk about today is the aspect of self-consciousness, that is sentience or sentience, as some people call it, or conscious thought. Computers, researchers, or scientists may often look to AI to make them artificial intelligence, as it were, and to confer upon them sentience. Now, I've had a bit of a thought or two about what actually some of the parameters, some of the features of self-identity or consciousness are. One thing that strikes me is that if you take the organic brain, people, it seems, do suffer brain damage from time to time, and however, let's say a small amount of damage, but their brain learns to work around it, and sometimes you do see large personality changes and identity changes, but sometimes you don't. I would put it to you that if you were to just knock off one neuron in a brain, you'd probably get away without too much change in personality. So I'm going to call this the sort of the name for this theory is what's a good name for it? The common direction or the common experience of all the parts of the brain that lead to self-identity. And what I mean by this is as follows. If you were to take, let's say we could recreate you identically at any point in time. Let's just say we could do it. So that an identical you would be standing next to you. However, I'd put it to you, almost like identical twins, that you would still feel yourself, let's say the original, inside your body at that point in time. The person next to you would feel themselves at that point in time, and you wouldn't necessarily know what they were thinking. I know there's some claims that twins can tell what each other's thinking and feelings at a distance, etc. But putting those to one side, it leads me to believe that one of the features of consciousness and self-identity is bound up in the general mass of the human neural tissue, the neurons, and the brain, and indeed the nervous system of the body, following the same time and velocity acceleration paths. That is, it's bound up, if we could call this a world line for lack of a better term, maybe one term would be, you basically, a very simple way of saying it, you go to all the same places that you go to. And this accounts for two phenomena. One, the constituent parts that make up your brain, and two, all the information that comes into it. So along that unique path, enough elements of your brain must receive data, and then you will still perceive you as you. So your world line, as it were, when that's a fancy name for saying where you go every day, who you speak to, what you do, what you don't do, all those things. A sufficient number, in fact the overwhelming number of your components of your body, and particularly your brain, have to experience that so that you internally perceive you are still that person. And it lends itself to saying that yes, you can knock off individual neurons here and there and you wouldn't notice a lot of difference. But if you were to recreate an identical person to yourself, immediately they would be in a different physical spot and they would have different inputs. So it would seem that consciousness arises quite uniquely to each system. However, if you were to integrate, in the same way you take neurons out, if you were to integrate extra processors on there, you would still feel this self-identity, I believe. This is part of the theory. So it shows there might be ways to augment the brain, as it were, or yourselves, and still retain your self-identity, even though it might be an expanded one, in the same way as going the other way by knocking off neurons or maybe brain parts, brain sections due to injury, you get changed identities, but still sometimes a sense of self is conserved. What this leads me to next is to consider a way of preserving human structure, and that is eventually if we can create a device that functions as a neuron and is indistinguishable by our bodies as not being a neuron, we could, and then we have the technology to place it in place of a neuron, we could eventually replace a whole brain atom by atom, neuron by neuron, with a type of neuron that will be better and more resilient, so it won't experience apoptosis for lack of oxygen. It probably won't need oxygen. It will simply go into a conservation mode, or like a calculator, it will turn on, turn off, or a computer turn on, turn off if it gets to an adverse position. But I believe that will be a step forward in the improvement of the human condition, so we're not subject to the vagaries of disease and aging, as it were, and also for the increase of our capacity as beings, as it were, for learning and appreciation and even understanding others, because you can probably integrate other people's experiences through a system. But I think this idea of this path that the majority of neurons have to experience is quite an important one to the way we perceive ourselves as conscious.